I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is the Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration.
Yeah, it just feels so artificial. It just feels like hijacking a profession, hijacking a discipline, and keeping the mere mask of it by maintaining some concepts and putting a totally different content in it. That's very recent, and it doesn't have a lot of psychological scientific ground. And like you say, Sue mostly cites himself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it is. And you see citations, and they are to a blog
Mm-hmm.
or to a news page.
Mm-hmm.
So it just feels very artificial. It feels very fake. It feels like you said, like a parasite, uh, like hijacked the system and turned it into something completely different, Reinhold.
Okay. Today I'm speaking with Olga Reinholdt. And Olga, you are a former counseling student, is that correct?
Yep.
And so I don't know very much about your story, but I'm really eager to learn more. And it sounds like you had a really difficult experience in graduate school and learned a lot. So perhaps we'll just start with what interested you in going to graduate school for counseling in the first place?
Mm-hmm. So I have a master's degree in psychology. I got it in Russia, and I got a lot of continued education, and I practiced. I was pretty much like Russia doesn't have licensing, so I was pretty much a practicing psychology practitioner. Um, and because I live in America, I wanted to, I guess, legalize my job here and just get a license that would allow me to continue doing what I'm doing and what I love doing.
Mhm.
I had a coaching accreditation in America before, and I combined that, but I wanted to go into a licensed profession pretty much, and that's why I started the degree. Going after PhD in psychology was an option, but it just seemed like too much in terms of investment, and it seemed like I don't really need that to do what I want to do, that is working with people. And counseling felt right. Um, I wouldn't say that I had a very difficult experience. I heard the conversations with other people, and I think that you and those other people had it much worse.
Mm.
I didn't really have uh, any pressure because I didn't speak out,
Mm.
and I just started noticing that something's wrong, and I started researching it, and I quit, and I just quit before I could get any pushback.
Okay, so you quit relatively early on in the program after you noticed that
Yeah,
it wasn't going in a way that you felt was correct.
right. I quit just a week ago,
Okay.
and uh, that's how I found you. I
Hmm.
started looking for like counseling K-crop programs, whistleblower reviews, all those
Hmm.
keywords, and that's how I found your blog. And it helped me realize a lot. And another thing that I did, well, I guess I would go through the red flags that I saw first,
Hmm.
and it was um, in legal and ethical. We started talking about microaggressions, and we started being divided into groups to talk about our uh, privilege and all that. And I honestly, like I said, I don't know what you mean by dominant group that have has privilege. And they said, well, you're white. Like, I don't, what do you mean? I'm a Russian from Kazakhstan. I don't know how that even applies to me. And they said, well, your skin is white. And that was, really, you're in a psychology studies and that's your judgment of a person? Like I couldn't believe that I heard that. Um so, and just the way that conversation goes and how that group went, and how even me saying like I don't really understand what you mean by dominant group felt like there's this like condescending attitude maybe. And it's like, okay. Another part that I really didn't like is we had a debate and we were just randomly divided into groups that, like, in a debate you don't stand for your opinion, right? You stand for the part that you're assigned. That's the point of debate in academia. And as the debate went, a couple of students who were, I can say woke, right? Like we operate with that term. They just started screaming and yelling. And that was on a subject they didn't even care about.
Really?
And I like it felt like that's the mode of conversation, whatever the subject is. And I was looking at the professor and like, what are you gonna do about that? And the professor was totally fine with it. So that made me question what was going on. And then of course, after that legal and ethics course, and we have a concentrated course and then another course. We finish the whole course before we go to the next one. So I already got materials for the next one, which is multicultural diversity counseling. And that had the Sue and Sue textbook. And that's when I'm like, I do not want to go through this. I don't, this is not healthy. So that made me think, okay, if that's the training, and because I already trained in psychology, I could tell that this amount of learning about, say, psychological theories and developmental theories are not going to help. You need more understanding. Like you need to read Freud, you need to read Adler to understand their frame of mind. You need to think like a therapist. You need to read therapists for that. You can't just read about their concepts and hope to apply it. So I started wondering, how does it actually work from the client's point of view? And I started asking people I know on Facebook, communities that I was in, online, like if you had that experience and you have something to share. I just wonder how you experienced licensed counselors as a client. Oh, and that's when I heard there were some really horrible stories.
Really?
Yeah, I did not believe, like, I heard that there's problems in colleges. I heard that colleges go woke. I heard that academia goes woke. And I'm like, well, things happen. People want their clickbaits. A lot of people build their persona based on that fight and all that. And when I enrolled, I was certain that normal people in a small, normal Christian college, they're just learning their craft and they're just working in their craft, and none of that happens. I was delusional. This is like what I thought was exaggeration and dramatizing was not exaggeration and dramatizing. And my college is not even a woke college.
Really?
Yeah, like I must tell that they're really smoothing over the K crap. Like they don't make it that uncomfortable. They try to make it as inclusive in the healthy sense of the word as possible. So they try to avoid that. But they still have to go through the curriculum. And you can still feel that like something is happening. So when I started asking people, I found out that a lot of harm was done to children. And that's something that really got me triggered. Like that's where I drew the line, and I'm like, I'm not taking any part in it. And I guess that's my main focus, and that's what
Mhm.
we can talk about further, is the impact on children. And um yeah, I think that counseling as it is in K-crap, like licensing curriculum, I think it causes more harm to children than good. Adults, it varies. And if adult finds a counselor that understands them, listens to them, they can just steam out, they can self-regulate.
Mhm. Mhm.
Children cannot do that. They need a totally different work. And from what I heard, at best, they just don't get help. And for a child not to get help means that it will get worse.
Mhm.
A child cannot self-regulate. They learn that this problem they're suffering from is unsolvable. So they develop this sense of helplessness. They develop the learned helplessness. And they develop compensation mechanism that starts messing up with their personality and their mental health. And that's at best. Like if they don't get any intervention whatsoever, just that superficial one. And that's what happens most of the times from all the research that I've done talking to people who were on the receiving end.
Mhm.
Um, but I also heard horrible stories of taking a child from a healthy child that was mandated to see a counselor because, say, parents are in divorce,
Mhm.
to a depressed, suicidal, lost, academically incapable youth over the period of counseling.
Mhm.
And you can say it's a coincidence, and maybe it is, but it's a weird coincidence. Like a child gets worse over a period of counseling. This is at least strange.
Mhm.
And you can't explain it by puberty. Yes, the puberty comes and it changes child's behaviors and all that and the crisis, but that's what you go to counseling for, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
there should be something that helps the child go through puberty, and the crisis becomes more of a changing levels and depths of self-reflection
Mhm.
than this brokenness. Um, and and I also see the mechanisms that are in place in the curriculum to make
Mhm.
sure that exactly this damage happens to children. So I don't think that's a coincidence.
So just to kind of recap your experience that you're describing, you started school, you did, it sounds like it was one module at a time, one educational, I guess, course at a time, and it was pretty
Mm-hmm.
intensive, just that one course, and then you'd move on to the next.
Yeah.
So you got through an ethics and like professional ethics and legal liability type course on the boundaries of the profession.
Mm-hmm.
And you just barely started this multiculturalism course before you said, okay, that I just can't, this is not psychology as I understand it, because
Yeah.
you have the background and training in psychology taught from a different perspective, from a
Yeah.
non-woke or non-social justice perspective. So
Yeah. Just pragmatic. Yeah.
yeah, and I've wondered, what do you even call that? Because I didn't have a master's in psychology. I had a bachelor's in psychology prior to
Mm-hmm.
starting this master's program, but it was from an older time. It was from, I think I graduated college in 2008, so I'd taken a long time off, and it was taught so differently. We didn't have this social justice ideology in the curriculum, at least not noticeably. Perhaps
Mm-hmm.
there was some of it seeding, but I didn't I didn't see it. And so
Mm-hmm.
what you're describing, when you're hearing these new ways of looking at things, is you're perplexed by it and kind of horrified, it sounds like, because you had a different background and training, you understood psychology differently, and now you're hearing this sort of really reductionist perspective on like, oh, you have this color skin, that means you're this kind of person. And that doesn't make sense based on your human experience or your educational training in your background. And so your description of that is really great because you describe your red flags. And that first one I'm curious about is when you tried to ask about like, what are these concepts you're telling me? Dominant group, individual from a dominant group. Will you explain that to me? And the response you're getting back was condescending. I think that's a really there's so much about this that's kind of hard to empirically put your finger on, but there's this sort of feeling that's being conveyed, almost like you're being put into a double bind where there's two different messages being conveyed at the same time. One is I'm going to tell you the information with my mouth, but the other one is I'm going to express something to you non-verbally at the same time that doesn't quite match what I'm telling you. And so you were given this with a dose of condescension, and that really seems significant because that's a thing that I experienced as well. I felt like when I was back in graduate school and I was studying and I was hearing all these social justice concepts, I felt like a kid who must have missed a week of school because I don't know what everybody else is talking about. And when I tried to catch up on some of it, it was all through implication. And I was supposed to just know this. Unlike any other social or psychological or educational concept, which is conveyed carefully. And everybody has made sure, we're going to talk about this. This is how we're framing it. Here's why. Here's the background on this theoretical perspective, and we're really going to make sure everybody feels grounded in it. But this is something different. It's like, we're just going to drop this and expect you all to pick it up without discussing it. Was that kind of how you experienced that as well?
Yeah, and I'm from a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about cultural diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this schizophrenic ambivalence of message.
Mm-hmm.
Like what is being said with words is exactly the opposite from what's being experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's like I think I'll give an example. I talked to a person not in a college, but she's from the college, and she was explaining me how I was a social fascist.
Okay.
Because I made a point that certain issues should be discussed by people competent in those issues and trained in them.
Okay.
And if you don't have a status, but like you don't have your license or your education or whatever, but you are competent in that. And you say things that make sense and that tell me that, yes, you really studied this. I have a problem what's on your business card, right? But if a person is not competent and obviously is not competent, then like I have this is my position. We all can have our opinions, but if we offer opinions, they must be competent.
So this is a personal sort of metric. This is by which you want to engage with other people on a given issue. It's not how is that fascist? I'm wondering how that's fascist, because that's nothing to do with government. That's just I personally want to talk about things with people who seem pretty informed about the things that they have large opinions about.
So they call it fascist because you appeal to a group. It's a group preference, and you're like, oh, my group is educated in this, and therefore we're better than your group that is not educated in this. So they call this social fascism. And that's the example of, and I said, like, it's always been called ad hominem. Why giving it another name? Ad hominem works. And if I cannot like really answer your argument substantially, excuse my English, it's not always, sometimes it fails me. and I just go, oh, you're this and that, like, yeah, I don't know, you're not a doctor, you cannot talk about it, right? Yes, you can complain that I'm using ad hominem
Mm-hmm.
because this is ad hominem. Uh, Fascism?
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. Like, this is, it's, that's just a huge insult.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it sounds like it's very charged, loaded language, very emotionally
yeah,
charged language.
yeah, there's violence, there's genocide, there's all this, there's the war reference. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm from a culture that lost 27 million people fighting fascism. It's
Mm-hmm.
a personal insult, I'm sorry. Again, if we speak culture, if you want to be culturally sensitive,
Right,
we may
right.
use
There's a
like
lot of
other
irony in
words.
that. There's so
Yeah,
much irony if we're going to worry about microaggressions when they apply to these groups, but we don't care at all about understanding the linguistic significance of things that we use for these other groups. There's so much hypocrisy in that.
yeah, and that's that schizophrenic genic
Hmm.
effect when
Hmm.
you, and
Crazy
that's
making.
hypocrisy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and what this person told me is that whether, and I said, this is your concept, and I'm not binded by your concept.
Hmm.
And she said, no, it exists whether you agree with it or not.
Hmm.
In school, we were taught that that's physical phenomena that exist whether you know about it or not.
Hmm.
But they're treating this concept as this physical phenomena that you're supposed to know and abide by
Hmm.
because their group agreed on it.
Hmm.
And again, the irony, your group decided to call it this way, and now I somehow am supposed to accept that. Didn't you just call it social fascism? So,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's,
it's yeah, very hypocritical in so
yeah.
many ways, on so many levels. And you described also the experience of this debate where everybody was assigned different perspectives, and you witnessed some of the students, you said screaming, so they kind of
Mhm,
they really lost their emotional regulation while trying to be engaging with some intellectual topic. So,
mhm.
can you describe that a little bit more? And what was the, you said they were woke students and that it was tolerated from them. Did they go into woke talking points?
Well, I mean, this particular student introduced herself with the pronouns,
Hmm.
and she has a wife, and she has green hair. Uh, it's like it walks like duck, it walks like duck. So I assume, that's my assumption.
Hmm.
Um, it was a nature versus nurture conversation, like debate, and we're
Hmm.
just supposed to, it's a mental exercise, right?
Hmm.
Like, and we were supposed to talk about nature, uh, nature perspective.
Hmm.
Again, just as a mental exercise, and the other side was supposed to talk about nurture. And when I said something about how certain disorders and conditions are defined by genetics and organic damage. And that speaks in favor of nature. And yeah, and the student, I don't know, she seemed triggered maybe,
Hmm.
but she just went very emotional about how how she's treating her partner's son. So she went into this like personal examples of how, because they create so certain environment, this boy is thriving, and there's all this like personal emotional information that had nothing to do with the debate.
Hmm.
And again, like, neither of us even care about that perspective that much. It's just an assignment.
Hmm.
So it felt like it's just the mode of communication. It's
Hmm.
just the mode of disagreeing. And it's like Solomon Ash experiment. It's just by flip of a coin.
Hmm.
These are my people and these are my enemies, and that's
Hmm.
all it takes
Hmm.
to engage in this like emotionally pressuring, and like not logical discussion at all.
Hmm.
It's a small thing, but um, that that a professor didn't hold the class to the standard where debates are debates and a mental exercise. That worried me.
Well, and it also seems like if you're in a cohort of students who are training to become counselors, you're the exercise would have some bearing on your ability to do that, to be sort of emotionally removed from an issue and be able to discuss it in a calm,
Mm-hmm.
rational, and non-emotional manner. And for that student to behave in that way, it doesn't bode well for her to be able to later work with clients who are going to bring a lot of issues to her. She centered
Mm-hmm.
herself in that issue and then became very emotional. And the professor allowed it and didn't re-educate or help to
Mm-hmm.
change that perspective and help the class to see. And of course, in that, I could see that that might be a difficult position for the professor to be in because you don't want to humiliate the student by calling them out as an example. But there might be a gentle way and certainly a responsibility on the part of the professor to help the
Mm-hmm.
students see that that there are different ways to engage with material. And
Yeah.
especially something in this case that was assigned, it wasn't something that should have just been organically being brought up by that student in a really passionate way.
Yeah, it wasn't something that would really have trigger for her. It's
Hmm.
just a mental academic exercise. Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that that is the problem because um this behavior becomes enabled and it's already strong and it becomes enabled. And then when I hear from people who received
Hmm.
counseling service that they had their counselors pressuring them on things,
Right.
giving them really hurtful opinions and all that, again, like I see the cause and effect there now.
Right. Right. And that's the thing that I've been so interested to really get into with you. This is why I was so appalled at my own training because these people in these programs, there are some people who agree with what they're hearing and are encouraged to continue in these behavior and thought patterns. And there are
Mm-hmm.
other people who are really troubled by it. People like yourself, who, if you had stayed in that program, I can imagine that you would have continued to confront things that were really difficult for you. It causes a lot of cognitive dissonance. It causes a lot of stress, a lot of difficulty deciding, do I say something? Do I just keep my head down? And this is really troubling for
Yeah,
people in these programs. And either way, you come out of these programs either very indoctrinated and very solidified in this one perspective of behavior and thought, the social justice ideological perspective, or you come out really deeply troubled
yeah,
and hurt by the experience. And neither of those are a recipe for good mental health care for your clients. And
exactly.
so this has real world impacts. And the thing that you are mentioning about children is particularly worrisome, partly in the light of all the increased funding to put counselors in schools at a higher per capita rate. So we have normalized counseling for kids to a degree that families just think it's an accessible thing that they should consider when there's some issue with their kid. Like you used the example of a child whose parents are going through a divorce. Well, let's give the kid a counselor. So it's pretty normal right now for kids to be seeing therapists.
Mm-hmm.
And we're making sure of that even more with the higher number of guidance counselors in schools. So your concerns around this are really important, and I'm curious to hear more about what you've
Mm-hmm.
discovered as you've been talking with people.
Yeah, let's get into this. So, I just want to say whatever that means. Uh, After my master's degree, I took a clinical psychology, continuing education, and childhood psychology, psychiatry, and neuropsychology.
Hmm.
So I had a pretty in-depth view on children development and especially development of what they call in neuropsychology, higher psychological functions. which is pretty much what school develops. And your school success on a neuropsychological level is your higher psychological functions. Reading, writing, self-regulation, willpower, attention, memory, etc. So, and I'm coming from that perspective. And again, I'm coming from perspective, I guess competence is one of my biggest values. And I don't expect other people to share it. It's just my thing, right? And I go by it. But one thing that I noticed, and that was another red flag that I'll mention, and I'll move on to the children's topic, was that being dismissive of competence. Yeah, there is this theory, but never mind. It was proposed by a white person. What does he know? And by the way, calling Freud a white privileged man, this is a person who barely escaped Holocaust, and you call him a white privileged male. Excuse me, it doesn't work that way. Again, because his skin was kind of pale on the pictures, that's all you go by. So yeah, it's ironic. It's ironic that Freud was considered privileged. Anyway, maybe Frankl was considered privileged, right? He had the privilege of going through that concentration camp.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But
yeah, it is very flattening. It is very reductive.
Yeah. And this dismissive attitude to the knowledge and to the theories, where in the end of each chapter on every psychological theory, you see kind of like, but never mind, what did they know? And we had this moment when in the book, countertransference was defined as pretty much when you exercise your emotions in a session. And I made a point in the class, that's not what's countertransference. Countertransference is a psychoanalytic tool. It's developed. You use your feedback, your emotions as a material for the client, and it takes skill. It's not just expressing your emotions for your own sake. And I was pretty much told to keep questions for our coordinator. So it's this like dismissal of competence and this game of this Karpman triangle, when you have a group of those who are victims, a group of those who are aggressors, and the savior is you as a counselor, and that's all there is. So that paradigm, when it comes to children, what I noticed is that children are systemically isolated from their family. And a lot of children come from counseling with this sense of estrangement from their family.
Right.
And they start getting these ideas that, oh, their mom's to blame for whatever's happening to them.
Right.
Again, this superficial idea of affective development and parents. Yes, parents have affect, but it's never to blame your mother. And for children, the best thing that any professional can and should and must do for children is to maintain that family dyad.
Right.
At least a dyad, right? A better family system when a child is one with the family, when adults, the parents or whoever is raising the child, who have the child's interest as their main priority. And it's not school counselors and it's not teachers, right? Because only parents have that as a main priority. Only parents really care about how the child does in the future, in adulthood, or in the nearest time, right? It should be relationships with those people that are primary for the children's mental health. What's happening is the opposite. Parents are not involved because confidentiality. Yes, you can keep certain aspects and conversations confidential, but you also involve parents in the process of helping children because it's their job. They are there. They're the main people to do that. There's nobody else.
Mm-hmm.
And you maintain relationships. And what I see is a child is isolated.
Mm-hmm.
They don't talk about what's going on. Parents don't know what's going on behind those
Mm-hmm.
closed doors. Maybe the child would open up to the parents if their relationships are intact.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not always the case, especially in puberty.
Mm-hmm.
And if when the child is going through puberty, what a professional, a mental health professional should be helping the child with is to feel that they still have parents to rely on.
Mm-hmm.
They still can and should get this help.
Mm-hmm.
They still can and should maintain that relationship. And they should have parents to see that the child is growing, that they have more agency, that they have more independence, that they need to have their own experience, make their own mistakes, and you make them meet in between when the puberty happens. What happens is this isolation. Like a child feels that parents are incompetent in being help and support. And maybe this counselor person is competent, but this person sees you for 1 hour a week, sorry, and they will start seeing you in a few months, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what a child needs.
Mm-hmm.
A child still needs security, and that secure attachment should be in place. And children take that attachment literally, right? If they're attached to an adult, they take it literally. They want that adult to be around. They depend on that adult. It's only natural for them. So not distinguishing that and creating this isolation with the family instead of strengthening relations with the family is one of the, I think it's the foundation of the harm.
Mm-hmm.
Another major thing is that, and I didn't take the whole counseling program. I looked through the syllabus, and you're probably the person to tell me if it's right or wrong. I don't believe counseling program trains counselors to help with academic issues. If a child cannot do math, if a child has dyslexia or dysgraphia, or a child has legit ADHD, I don't think counselors are really trained to address it because they are neuropsychological issues.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know how brain develops. You need to know how these functions work in the brain and what areas of the brain are deficient in their development, and how you can stimulate those areas of the brain to develop so the child can do better. For example, math requires spatial gnosis.
Mm-hmm.
If a child did not develop spatial gnosis for whatever reason, maybe there was health issues, maybe that the area of the brain was not developed properly because, I don't know, disease, toxicity, prenatal problems, physical trauma to the head, then a child cannot do math. It's not about teaching them math. It's not about motivating them to learn math. Their brain cannot physically do that. You need to grow those connections again. You need to recover their spatial gnosis and spatial coordination. I don't think counselors are trained to do that.
No, I think here that would be sectioned off as work for an occupational therapist. I think it would be specialized out. It wouldn't be the domain of the counselor. Yeah.
So if a child is not doing well in school, they're supposed to see a counselor. And how is the counselor going to address that?
Oh yeah, they're going to probe into emotional things. They're going to probe into introspection with the child.
Yeah.
This is exactly what happened to me when I was a kid.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. In school.
And guess what? If you have those deficiencies in the brain, which is they're called minimal brain deficiency. I mean, it's not a major neurological problem, but it is major when it comes to academic abilities, and behavior and socialization. And it all builds up because for a child, their main activity is studies, and pretty much how they do in school from say 7 to 12, how they do in school is the basis of their self-worth, right? That's the basis of their social skills and their social adaptation. So it's very important not just to be academically capable, but to grow as a person. And the child that has these deficiencies, first of all, this child is less likely to self-reflect emotionally, and they're less likely to self-regulate properly, and they're less likely to benefit from that introspection. They need games. They need to play. And yes, there's game therapy and play therapy, and it's great. But the games and the play process, they should be targeted at that particular deficiency that the child has. To define this deficiency, there's going to be a line of the tools, diagnostic tools, tests, again, games, observation. It takes time. I've never heard that being done. Like if a child goes to the counselor, if a child doesn't do well in school, parents are mandated to take the child to the counselor. They go to the counselor. They have those conversations, which most children reflect as, I don't know, we talked about something. Or there was pressure, didn't like it, something like that. Like you're supposed to open up. And that's it. And what do they come out with? I did what I was told to do, and it didn't help. I must be damaged. I think that's a big problem. If occupational therapy is what becomes mandated instead, and it can address it, that's awesome, and that's what should be done with the help of a parent. And I don't know, maybe it's the people I talk to, but the people I talk to went through this process, doesn't do well in school, goes to counseling, ends up either getting all these ideas of wokeness and how everybody else is guilty, or they just feel helpless because that didn't help and the problem wasn't solved.
So it's really kind of a twofold conceptualization of the problem. There's the first, the counseling isolates the child and separates the child from the family. And the second one is the deficits in the training and the work that's done to actually address a lot of the problems that kids are coming in with. So they're addressing it in the wrong way. And they're in the process, they're creating distance and hurting the attachment between the child and their family of origin. I think this is really important to talk about because it seems, there's a point, at least in our modern development, when a young person sort of goes out into the world and takes stock of their family of origin and looks at all the ways that they were limited by the unique characteristics of their family. And so there's this look, I hear this a lot, and I know I went through this myself. It's kind of like you look back and you think about, who could I have been if my mom hadn't been whatever, maybe chronically depressed, or whatever unique issues are there in your own family. You kind of imagine this blank slate where you could have launched out with if my parents hadn't been poor, I could have gotten into a better school, whatever it is. So there's this sort of taking stock of the limitations of your origin story. And then one has to integrate that and make the best of their strengths in order to go forward and have agency and try to make a good life for themselves. But the truth is that we all do have limitations as human beings. And so as parents, we also have limitations. And our kids are shaped in part by by our strengths and our challenges as people. And if you start doing this process of guided introspection and inventorying with a child who's still young and still at home, what you do is you really give that kid a sense of resentment and helplessness. And it is something that concerns me quite a bit, that we don't see these counselors who are working with kids being more family systems oriented. We see
Exactly.
this real individual therapy ethos with, and I've spoken with several people now who their the therapist transed their child, suggested a gender problem to
Mhm.
their child who was going through something else. And after this, the family has dealt with the child falling into gender ideology. But the origin of that being, or this, the solidification of that identity really happening during a therapeutic relationship. And the therapeutic relationship was one that the parent was shut out of. Like you're saying, the child is isolated, but speaking with this person who's trained in this very particular way and has this particular ideological philosophy and has full access to their child
Yeah.
without their knowing what the content of these discussions is. And as you say, there are some things that would need to be kept perhaps confidential, just like with any conversation. But the degree of confidentiality being so rigid for a minor child who's still in the home with their parents, I think
Yeah.
it's a serious problem for this profession.
Yeah. It cannot be informed consent
Mhm. Yeah.
if a parent does not vet the counselor.
Hmm.
There is like a child cannot give an informed consent
Right, right,
to get this counseling.
right.
It's impossible. Um, and again, going back to this um, um, ambivalency of message is you're supposed to get informed consent, right?
Hmm.
In the ACA Code of Ethics, it's uh, but then the practice of working with children, there is no informed consent
Hmm.
because parents cannot vet the counselor.
I spoke with one person who said that their child's counselor refused to allow the parent to cancel her counseling relationship with the child. The parent became concerned. The child was experiencing many more difficulties, and the parent wanted to discontinue the counseling relationship. The counselor
Mhm.
said it was not possible by state law that only the child could discontinue that relationship because the child was 13 or 14 or whatever age, but was over 12, which was considered to be a line. And I found this to be such a shocking thing that this you've invited the state into your life by inviting this counselor in. You've now
Yeah.
invited a legally binding relationship in some cases.
It's an
It,
outright abuse.
it is, yeah.
Like a minor, putting a minor in a position when he or she is the only one responsible, like capable of making that decision while being under this influence.
Mhm.
Uh, well, I mean, in any logical world, that
Mhm.
would be a conflict of interest in the least.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know how it happens and how it is allowed to happen.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of dark things are happening between counselors and children.
Yeah, I think you're right. When I was in graduate school, I did take a human development course, so it was child development. And I was surprised by how little family was emphasized in that course,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
compared to prior human development courses that I took in undergrad. And I actually did my first human development course would have been when I was in high school because I did a vocational training program to become an early childhood educator. So I was a certified
Mm-hmm.
preschool teacher, really. But
Mm-hmm.
that was my first exposure to these kinds of concepts. And then later I was exposed to these concepts again in college, university, and then again at the graduate level. And what I found was that there was a high degree of similarity between the first two educational programs. So there was it was consistent. So the information that I learned young was built upon by the information that I received later when I was in college. And then there was a great diversion, it diverted in graduate school. So this training program that was very social justice oriented was also teaching development in a different way. And what I found was that a lot of it was based on transient bonds between children and teachers, children and peers in their cohort-based learning programs. And I asked about how does this apply? Do we not have general knowledge on child development that is not based in an age cohort based academic institutional development? And they
What
said, no,
about
we really
family?
don't have, yeah, we don't have studies on family and homeschoolers also. Like how is the default child development arc? Can we look at what that is? Or do we have to look at just how important this academic institution that we're churning our kids through is in their lives? And the people that were in that course, most of them were oriented toward working with children, were in school to become counselors in order to work with children. Almost none of them were parents themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like what we have is a distorted education on child development, and
Mm-hmm.
then an implementation of that by a largely childless workforce that
Yeah.
that doesn't recognize the importance of family.
Yeah, call me a social fascist, but there are some things that you have to experience
Yeah.
to know the full depth. Like, I don't know if you never been with your child from birth to their school age and to them coming of age, there's tons of things that you have no idea of, and you will never read it in a book.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that only mothers and fathers can be counselors, but if you don't have children and you become a child, like, well, first of all, why going into it, like, it's not exactly a very um it will not make you rich exactly, right? So it's a
Mhm.
calling.
Mhm.
And I can't understand what can be a calling there, especially if not having children as a choice.
Well, one of the things that I've thought is that we are, with our declining family size, we have smaller families. So we have more families with an only child, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
with two kids, or a big family would be three now. So we don't
Yeah.
see a lot of really big families. I have four kids, but that's really uncommon even in, among people that I know. It's more common to have a child. A lot of people don't have any kids at all. But we have smaller family sizes, and we have these cohort-based, age-based cohorts that go through school. So all the 9-year-olds are with other 9-year-olds, maybe 10.
Yeah,
And
it's
the
very
11-year-olds are
damaging
with,
that
yeah.
way.
And so what we've lost in that process is a process of peer-based mentorship that you would
Mm-hmm.
have previously had, that would have existed in families with maybe 8 kids, or and a bunch of cousins around and a bunch of friends. So kids would be running in mixed age groups often, maybe in a
Mm-hmm.
church group or some other kind of community setting that wasn't so strictly age segregated.
Yeah.
And there would be plenty of opportunities for kids to play all the different roles to each other. And I think that it's important for us to go through some of those things, like mentorship is something that really enriches someone. It's like the C1
Yeah.
learn, what is it? C1 do one, teach one. There's a process of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of learning from someone, but then being able to give back the learning to someone else. So I wonder if a part of the impulse for so many young people to go into counseling is actually an organic impulse that's
Mm-hmm.
there to want to reach back and touch the lives of younger people in a very normal way that we
Mm-hmm.
should want, that's benevolent. But there's something twisted when we're doing it through the lens of these institutions that have so much power, and when we're
Yeah.
educated in a really ideological, biased way as we
Mm-hmm.
do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be, I agree, that can be a healthy drive.
Hmm.
And a person with healthy drive is capable of doing a lot of good. It can be also an unhealthy drive for power.
Hmm.
And then that person can do a lot of harm. And K-crap programs do not um, do not filter.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's like
that's right.
both individuals can get their license and continue
Hmm.
working.
Hmm.
Um, and yes, this again, when I studied in Russia, and I know people think different things about Russia. I can say that Russia is a highly pragmatic culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess without seeing that as pragmatic, we can assign, like people can assign all kinds of things to it, but it's just pragmatic. It just does that what works. Um, and there is a lot of emphasis. Well, pretty much we always learned that because the child's neurosystem is developing and it takes many years, um, adults, parents, they take over the functions that a child doesn't have yet. So it's a system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a system until we get a grown up, really. And it's just how it is. You cannot separate an adult from a child because a child naturally doesn't have certain functions. And somebody must carry out those functions for the child.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you have child with brain deficiencies, you use the same principle. You understand which functions a child doesn't have that is not normative for the age,
Mm-hmm.
but you replace those functions for them. And to your point about peers, it doesn't have to be parents, right? Peers
Mm-hmm.
can replace that function for them. If a child is still lacking programming and control because they're young or because it's not their strength yet, their older peers can replace it for them. And that's it, it works as a system.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have older siblings, then it is parents, of course. But when we separate children from all of that and we put them among peers with a strongly regulated relationship, and I'm homeschooled too, and I think we can talk hours about it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I am homeschooling. I'm not homeschooled
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mm-hmm.
I have two kids, and they're both homeschooled. Uh, and also, I always get this question: how do they socialize? Like naturally,
Mm-hmm.
because if you put in an artificial group with artificial rules and regulations, this is not socialization.
No, it's not.
It's anything but.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess, I guess in that system, counseling, I would say that occupational therapy would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a counseling that pretty much calls for reflection and all this emotional talk, and that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not right for the
Mm-hmm.
age and for the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But it's given the power, and the power that parents cannot control. And there is an agenda,
Mm-hmm.
and that agenda is in the ACA Code of Ethics. The list of 5 values, value number 3, social advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
That was one more thing I wanted to see if you cared to touch on a little bit because
yeah.
you mentioned early on that the school that you went to, I think you said they softened the K-CREP
Mhm.
requirements around this stuff. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were about that. I've tended to think that the softening of these things is like coating a pill to make it go down.
Yeah.
But there's actually, I'd rather have it be really bold so I can see it and recognize it. I think the softening performs a little bit of that dual messaging that
Yeah.
you've described a couple of times. So would
Yeah.
you kind of
Yeah,
say a little more?
I agree. And I don't think it was malicious intent, that
Mm-hmm.
softening. It's a small college in Kentucky in a very conservative area, and teachers are from all over. So it's not like that's representative, but administration is from there, and I get there is that mentality. And I think it has to do with that partially. A lot of it, I think, had to do with teachers just didn't want all that drama in their class.
Mm-hmm.
And some teachers were just, I mean, honestly, I like, I think all the professors I had questions to particular like behaviors and their particular, like what we discussed about the debates and the use of term. But overall,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it was a nice experience to to learn with them, and they skipped certain things. Like in theories of counseling, they skipped the whole postmodernism
Hmm.
chapter, which I appreciate. I read it, and that was another red flag, really, that it's in the curriculum. It's bizarre. Um, uh, when we had those breakout rooms,
Mm-hmm.
uh, we didn't like the professor did it in the end of the class, so we don't really come back. And
Okay.
so she removed herself from that, it seemed
Mm.
like.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I guess maybe you can call it avoidance.
Mm.
So I think there was an avoidance of those really uh potentially troublesome subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. Like, but we're still supposed to be in that environment. And the truth is that I would probably make it through the school just fine
Mm-hmm.
if I kept my mouth shut. If the school itself was not that committed
Mm-hmm.
to ideology, I would probably make it. But where would I make it into? That was my question.
Mm.
It's not that I cannot make it through the program. It feels like I can, but it only like nicely and smoothly, it's like cooking a frog in a warm water, right? It's nicely and smoothly brings you into this world where you now have your student loan and
Mm-hmm.
you have this years and effort put into getting this license, and
Mm-hmm.
it's much harder to drop something that you have paid for.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that it's maybe if it was more outright, and maybe it should be that this is the program for the people with this ideology and these values and all that, and just keep it there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so everybody knows that when they go to a counselor, they get a person who's of certain ideology,
Mm-hmm.
and there will be certain conversations and certain ideas. And if this is something you know will help you, it's like going to there's all the spiritual consultants,
Mm-hmm.
there's biblical counselors, there's Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
counselors. Like, you don't go to a Buddhist counselor expecting something secular,
Right.
right? Like if you're a pragmatist and materialist and you go to a Buddhist counselor, expect to be annoyed.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knows that, and
Mm-hmm.
there's no conflict,
So
right?
you're suggesting a social justice designation for counselors who are trained in this way
I
so
didn't
that
think
people know
about
what
it
they're
this way,
getting.
but yes,
Uh-huh.
I think that would be only fair, and I think that would be uh that would at least be just.
Mm-hmm.
You know what you're going for as a student, you know what you're going for as a professional, and you know what you're going for as a client.
Mm-hmm.
We had this interesting conversation in a class where one student said, and it was a different student, she said, I was considering doing an LGBTQ friendly practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what do you mean? Well, certain language, and like, it's you and a client.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't use certain language, you just don't use it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a problem with the language that client is using with you?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if it's okay for counseling, then we should understand that that's what counseling implies.
Mm-hmm.
So far, in a code of ethics, you are supposed to be okay with any language and any culture and any presentation and any presenting issues, right? That's what we learn. So I think if K-crap people were to ask my advice, I would be get off that fence and decide where you're standing and
Mm-hmm.
stop giving this mixed message to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really well said. It is a very mixed message. It's hard to tell what they're going for because it doesn't seem like they're coherent about it.
Yeah, like they get it's Aurelian, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
Ministry of Love, mental health.
Mm-hmm.
You go in there, you get anything but mental health.
Yeah.
Like it, yeah.
And so,
So
Olga, you decided to not pursue the licensed path, and now you're working as a life coach. Is that right?
yeah, I've been a life coach for 9 years.
Okay.
I had my problems with life coaching industry as well.
Hmm.
Um, but like, I should say that I reevaluate coaching industry now.
Looking better
Um,
after your experience with counseling.
right.
Hmm.
I mean, at least it does not, or well, it's been 9 years, so maybe a lot of things changed. But
Hmm.
last time I checked, it didn't call for any ideology and it
Hmm.
didn't assign social justice and social advocacy and all those roles.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a wild west in that nobody gives you a status quo.
Hmm.
If you if your services help, people will come and pay. If your
Hmm.
services don't help, I'm sorry, you don't get a name that will make you sound plausible and get a
Hmm.
salary, right?
Hmm.
So that there's a healthy competition there, and I think that's a healthy part of it. It can also go wrong because you have vulnerable people and people can manipulate for benefit. And yes, there is a code of ethics too, and then all kinds of things happen around it. But there is a competition. Like no coach can say you must bring your child here.
Hmm.
No coach can say no, you can't stop
It's free
our
market.
sessions. Yeah, it's a free
Hmm.
market. And I think that after I've seen like all this Orwellian reality, um, I appreciate it. I appreciate it much more than I did before. I thought it was uh well, maybe you're undertrained for that, which I still think like coaching undertrains you.
Hmm.
You need more knowledge about psychology to really help people as a
Hmm.
coach, I think. But then again, I am competency advocate.
Hmm. It's a
um,
strong theme with you.
right, yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's why I got my master's in psychology,
Hmm.
because I want to really understand things that I'm dealing with.
Hmm.
Um, so But like I said, I quit a week ago. And until then, I was identifying myself as somebody who's in pursuit of license.
Hmm.
So it's only been a week, and I have the credentials and I have a practice in
Hmm.
coaching. But because I was transitioning from that practice into a license, I'm kind of in this like
You're in,
little,
yeah, a little bit of a transitional state right now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still figuring out what to do. But after I've learned all this about children, I did not intentionally specialize it's just that for some reason the Russian curriculum puts a lot of emphasis on children's
Hmm.
development. Uh, I did not identify myself professionally as a childhood psychologist or anything. Although I did work with people who have problems with their children in coaching.
Hmm.
So I think I'm going to look this way. I think I'm going to see how I can help parents be helpful for their children
Hmm.
in development in school and socializing. And um well, ironically advocate for I was not going to advocate for anything, but since I was presented with that role, if I were to advocate for something, I would advocate for the closer, healthier bonds between children and their parents, and
Hmm.
understanding that it is within the family and in the dyad
Hmm.
with the parents that, or whoever replaces the parents, right? That the
Hmm.
child's mental health is in its best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been my opinion as well that
Mm,
for children and young adolescents, parent coaching is often a way to help
yeah.
solve problems or help families solve problems that they're
Yeah, it's
having with their young
sustainable.
people.
Yeah,
Much
it's a
more so than
sustainable
isolating the
way.
kid and giving them mixed messages about their own agency.
Exactly. Yes,
hmm
exactly. It's a
hmm
sustainable way. It's a evolutionary correct way. It's the reality. These are the people that children spend most time with.
hmm
There's no conflict of interest because parents are genuinely interested in the child's well-being,
hmm
while counselors need all this code of ethics to remind them of who is who is the client, right, and whose interests you work for. So yeah, I totally agree. Parents need the expertise, parents need the advice, parents need the coaching,
hmm
and maybe sometimes it will be parent and a child.
hmm
And it's building that connection and building up parents' competency that I think children will benefit way more than
hmm
from this practice of isolation and
hmm
mandatory isolation.
Right.
So I'll probably be developing that
In
way.
that
That's how I
direction.
feel now. Yeah, that's how I feel now. Maybe
hmm
I'm just outraged and it's the emotions big. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I really appreciate you drawing attention to this issue, and I appreciate your willingness to talk about this, especially when in your life this is such a fresh experience. I'm sure that there's a lot of disappointment and maybe some relief. There's a lot you spent a lot of time thinking about this decision, and so it's very significant for you. And I am grateful to you for your willingness to talk about it so openly and candidly.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Your project really helped me, and not just in making decision, but also in uh I was not in turmoil. Yes, I thought about it. Yes, I was indecisive, but I was not in turmoil because
Mm,
I didn't have this idea I'm the only crazy one.
mm,
Uh, because thanks to your project, I saw people who saw the same, and that told me, like, no, you're not crazy. It actually happens.
mhm.
And that was a lot of support.
I'm so
So,
glad to hear that. Yeah, it is very hard to feel like you're alone in that, and
yeah,
I'm glad to hear that the recordings can be helpful to other people.
yeah,
Where
yeah.
can people find your writing or get in touch with you if they're interested in working with you or would like to connect?
I have a blog and Instagram. I put small snippets of mental health ideas, and there'll probably be more on childhood now. There, it's a size and psychology PSY with Olga
hmm
or
Okay.
Olga Reinholdt. Just search by the name. And I moved those videos that I put there for you into YouTube for those who prefer YouTube channel. So it's the same Olga Reinhold. And well, I'm planning to upload more small videos there. Um, I have a blog on Medium, and that's where I complain about the coaching industry if somebody's interested. It's the same Olga Reinhold. You can just find me by the name.
Well, I'll be sure to include links to those in the
Mhm.
description of this video.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Olga. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. Same here.